Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Shrikrishna Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, our daily podcast. In April earlier this year, India and the United States signed a Memorandum of Understanding at the 2+2 dialogue. This MOU pertained to sharing space situational awareness data. The MOU signing is significant as this is the first time that the two countries have agreed to share the information gathered by each other's civilian and military sensor capabilities. But what really is space situational awareness? How is SSA achieved and what are the capabilities required to do so? And more importantly, what does it mean for US and India to sign such an agreement today? I'm Shrikrishna Upadhyaya, and to unpack all things SSA, I am joined by my colleague at Takshashila, Pranav R Satyanath, who happens to be our in-house space policy analyst. So welcome, Pranav.
Thank you.
So let's begin with the basics. What is SSA? Can you tell our listeners what exactly is it and why is it so important for all of us?
Okay, so when we talk about space situational awareness, by the phrasing of that itself, we can figure out that it is in some way connected to knowing what's happening in space, right? So space situational awareness, a more fundamental level, is about having a knowledge about what's going on in outer space, whether it's low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit, or sometimes even near Earth object, knowing what's happening in near Earth orbits, right? That is between the Earth and the moon or sometimes beyond the moon. But to have a more specific definition of what space situational awareness is, it is about knowing and predicting the activities that goes on within the space environment. So first, you need to know what exactly is going on. That is, you're supposed to track the artificial satellites and the leftover debris from rocket launches or dead satellites. You need to know which object is in which orbit. And second, you need to predict their actions, right? So because satellites orbits always degrade, satellites will eventually enter the Earth's atmosphere or burn up, or sometimes they may change their altitude. So it's also about knowing and predicting what's happening in space. And there are essentially, people always talk about space situational awareness hardware capabilities, which involves four important elements. First, it is the ground-based or space-based optical imaging sensors. So on the ground, you would have telescopes that can look at satellites, that can illuminate satellites, look at satellites, and accurately identify how many objects are there within a given area of outer space, whether it's low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit. We have space-based optical satellites where you have a satellite in space that essentially does a similar job. You have ground-based radars. Radars, like they do for planes, they reflect off electromagnetic signals and these signals get reflected back and you can tell what object it is. Similar thing happens for space where you use radars to reflect off electromagnetic signals and the satellites bounce back these radars and you're able to roughly tell how many objects there are in a given area. You have radio frequency ones. These are quite different and quite interesting because satellites are always emitting radio frequencies because they're communicating with ground stations. So there are ships, for example. Most of these radio frequency trackers are on ships in the ocean, and these trackers gather all the radio frequency signals emitted by satellites and they're roughly able to tell where these satellites are positioned. You finally have a new technology, laser ranging, where you just emit a beam of laser and the satellites reflect that beam, or the laser illuminates the satellite and an optical sensor is able to track that. So these are the four elements that are involved in what the hardware of space situational awareness: optical sensors, radars, radio frequency gathering devices, and laser ranging. What people forget often is that there is also a software element to this, because you not only have to gather the data, but to make accurate predictions about where space objects are, you need a good data processing and management system, which is a software element. I'm not a software engineer or an expert. So this is essentially the platform where you take massive data sets from different sources, right? Because your optical source is different from your radar source. So you need a software system that brings together all these different forms of data and collates it into something that's more identifiable and that can be visualized. The US, most importantly, does this where they have a visual identification system where they gather all this data and present it in the form of the Earth's globe, right? So they have something called a spacetracker.org. It's a website where you essentially have a planet-like shape. You have a globe, and around the globe, you have hundreds of thousands of objects that are orbiting this globe, and you can click on those objects. You can get an identification of what orbit it's in and what's the satellite's inclination or whatever. So there are two elements of this, and people always forget the second element, which is the data processing one. So we've spoken about what is SSA and what are the capabilities, but why is that required? In the early days of the space age, the US and the Soviet Union were in the space race, and each of them were launching a very, very large number of spy satellites and non-spy satellites. And basically, both sides wanted to know what the other side is launching. So it was mostly about spying on the other side or knowing what the other side is launching. And it did not have safety elements. But today it's actually changed. Many, many more actors, many hundreds of thousands and thousands of satellites every other month or every couple of months. We see companies like SpaceX that launch about 40 satellites because they want to have a small sat constellation. So when you have more number of satellites, the possibility of collisions of satellites is possible. This creates space debris. So there's a safety element to this. Space situational awareness not only has a spy element, but also has a safety element where countries want to know whether their satellites can be kept safe from collision or it can be kept safe from space debris. Because, conducting anti-satellite launches for military purposes creates a lot of debris in space, and this debris usually doesn't fall off or re-enter the Earth. So when it stays there, it creates a lot of problems because they're traveling at such high speeds that even a small piece of metal can act like a bullet and destroy another satellite. So today, space situational awareness is not only used for tracking what the other satellites are doing for military purposes, but there's also a safety element so that every country's satellite is kept safe from collision and measures can be taken to avoid such collisions. If you're able to predict that two satellites might collide or two satellites are coming too close for comfort, then they can change their orbital parameters to avoid such collision. So two elements of that, the military dimension and the non-military dimension, which is why SSA is used for.
That's really fascinating because so the way I understand it is this is a real-time surveillance of outer space. We are looking at all the objects which are floating around the Earth in different orbits, and we are gathering data about their positions. And this, as you said, is used for military purposes, obviously, for surveillance to make sure that your enemies are not up to something which you have no idea about. And also so that we are able to alert ourselves if there is a danger posed to some other space or space object or to the Earth because of falling debris and so on and so forth. So thank you for that, Pranav. But could you also tell us which are the countries? I presume it is US from what you said, but what are the capabilities of different countries and what are the American SSA capabilities especially, and how has it served their purpose?
So because we're talking about a US-India data sharing agreement, it's important to understand what the US has. And you're right, the US has by far the largest set of hardware to track objects in space, right? It started off in the early days simply by having radars on Earth. And these radars were not for tracking satellites. In fact, they were simply for tracking ballistic missiles that could come from the Soviet Union or China. Eventually, the US Air Force realized that this technology could also be used for satellites. So you have a large number of missile tracking radars that have become a part of the SSA network. For example, in the Thule Air Base in Greenland, there is early warning radar that can be used for space situational awareness. In Alaska, there was a multi-object tracking radar, which was up for actually tracking nuclear warheads that could re-enter the atmosphere. And again, because nuclear warheads are entering from space, you can also track satellites or space debris in low Earth orbit. So the US by far has the largest number of capabilities, including optical satellites, which comes from a civilian side. This is a part of something called as the United Nations, the United States Space Surveillance Network, SSN. And to this, an advanced set of radars was added in 2020, and this became something called Space Fence. Near the Marshall Islands, they have a set of tracking radars which form the space fence, and this provides an additional layer of capabilities. But of course, the US also has on islands like in Diego Garcia's, it has a optical telescope site where you have a a small telescope that is tracking radars. And they also have sites in Australia where they have placed their electro-optical telescopes and radars for helping with this tracking. But the problem is that the US, even if this large set of capabilities, does not have full coverage. So the US has signed bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements with the European Union, NATO, the UK, Australia, and all these other and all its partners like Japan and South Korea to have a more or less complete coverage. But even with so many assets, the US has not been able to have complete coverage, particularly in South Asia, the Southern Asia, and most of Africa. So the Southern Hemisphere is out of American coverage, which is one of the reasons why the US is so eager to have bilateral agreements with countries in Asia so that they can cover the Southern Hemisphere. I should also point out that it's not just SSA capabilities. These radars and telescopes are not just operated by national agencies like the US Space Force, but also by private companies. The most popular private company is Leo Labs. It has LA electro-optical sensors, and it has a software platform that collects data in low Earth orbit and provides it as a service to companies. So they do something called conjunction assessments. Conjunction assessment is basically a fancy term to say assessing whether two satellites or two space objects will collide or not by predicting orbital parameters. So a lot of private companies do this. There's an Indian company called Digantra Space, which also plans to launch satellites into space, which does laser tracking. So quite exciting things also happening on the space side. So if you count American private space capabilities, the US by far has the best capabilities. Yeah, but still, it's far from something that can provide full global coverage.
So that's interesting. So I understand that the US has been the front runner when it comes to acquiring and building SSA capabilities, and it has also sort of been good at networking with other spacefaring nations and has entered into different agreements for data sharing, which I'm sure will bolster its SSA capabilities even more. Let's talk about India now. So when it comes to SSA, what has been the trajectory in India? We have a specialized space agency in the form of ISRO, and I'm sure there are a lot of private players also who are coming up in this sector. So what are India's SSA capabilities like? Where did we start and where are we today? And also, could you tell us and since we spoke about the MOU at the beginning, could you also tell us what does India offer to US exactly?
Yeah, India's SSA story, because we spoke about how SSA hardware consists of four elements, right? So earliest can go back to ground-based radio frequency tracking. Whenever India launched a satellite, the satellite signals would be relayed to a ground station, and this is how India was able to track its satellite. And I'm pretty sure that India was able to also gather signals from other countries' satellites and been able to track it at a rudimentary level or at a suboptimal level. The real Indian SSA story actually begins in 2020 when ISRO set up something called as Project Netra. Netra standing for the Network for Space Object Tracking and Analysis. I'm going to say that again. The real ISRO story of space situational awareness began in 2020 with something called Project Netra, where Netra stands for Network for Space Object Tracking and Analysis. So Project Netra essentially was a big project where India wanted to set up radars and telescopes that would be able to track objects as small as 10 centimeters between the ranges of 3,400 kilometers and 2,000 kilometers. There are some capabilities where India can track up to 36,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And for those capabilities, India has a long-range multi-object tracking radar in Ladakh, Leh, and they have also one in Sriharikota in Andhra Pradesh. Other than that, they have a wide set of telescopes, optical and infrared telescopes. One of them being in Bangalore. So in Bangalore, we have a telescope. In Pune, we have a telescope. Mount Abu, Nainital, and in a region called Handle. So India has a set of capabilities where it is able to mix and match radar and optical signals to create a fairly well constructed picture of a small area of Earth, of a small area of outer space. In that sense, what India can give the US is what US has been lacking for so long, which is a part of a part of South Asia or Southern Hemisphere, which is being covered by Indian SSA capabilities. China has, of course, a large set of SSA capabilities because China is a nuclear power and they want to track missiles from the US and Russia. But China, as of now, has not been ready to share this data with the US for obvious political reasons. So what India offers is this coverage that the US has never had before or has had in a very limited capacity. So India, in this sense, has given itself room to cooperate with the US. If India did not have its own SSA capabilities, then it would be unlikely that the US would be ready to exchange its own set of data. Of course, because SSA is for both for civilian and military purposes, the MOU could be also interpreted as something having a defensive nature, where US and India are sharing defense data or data of military nature. But this is not clear because ISRO does not handle military data. And this is an MOU signed between ISRO and the US. Right. So we don't know how much of defense capability, how much of space military's data can be shared. But of course, on the civilian side, India and US, India can benefit a lot because it can get a wider coverage of space and it can make sure that its own satellites are quite safe.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight into how India and US can mutually benefit from this agreement. Overall, I find this talk about SSA very fascinating because, we have developed capabilities where we are tracking small objects thousands of kilometers away in the outer space. It's almost like, you're keeping track of every grain of sand on a beach. So with this, we will take a short commercial break and come back with more questions for Pranav. Welcome back to All Things Policy. Before the break, we were speaking to Pranav about the data sharing agreement, SSA data sharing agreement, which US and India have entered into, and how this can have both civilian and military benefits. Of course, as of now, since ISRO is the party to the agreement, we are looking more in terms of civilian cooperation. However, I believe scope extends for greater collaboration between the nations, even militarily, in terms of the SSA. In any case, Pranav, I wanted to ask you, so is this a model that can be extended to include, say, many more players? I understand the benefits will be immense because when all nations pull together their SSA capabilities, they're able to create a better and broader picture of the outer space. So can this be extended? And if so, how do you think a multilateral data sharing agreement would look like?
So India is not the first country with which US has had a bilateral agreement. As I mentioned, very early on, US has signed so many of these agreements with so many countries to share space situational awareness data. So bilateral agreements and to some cases multilateral agreements, because NATO is a multilateral military alliance and they are sharing data, right? So the only question is, how can non-military alliances actually share this data? Like, for example, can India to share the data? And there are sort of three questions that we're supposed to think about, or three sort of challenges that we're supposed to think about. The first is the compatibility of this data, because the systems are so different and the way the data is processed is so different. We have to think about how these countries are actually are they simply going to give data, or are they going to process the data and provide a processed way of sharing this agreement? That is the first question. How well can they manage this technical aspect, technical challenge? What would be the processing agreement? Would they jointly develop a software or platform that can sort of seamlessly integrate all the data they have? The second question for multilateral is it that if you want to have a truly multilateral SSA capability, not just a data sharing, who is going to pay for building these radar sites, radar or electro-optical sites, or constructing the software, coding the software? Right? This is a very political question as well as a technical question, also as a financial question. Everywhere money is involved, they will ask who gets ownership of such a technology, who should do more research. So these are questions that will obviously be answered. The third one is, do we actually require how much of multilateral agreement do you require? Right? Sometimes you just want enough coverage so that you just want so much coverage and you don't want repetition. So the problem is when you have multiple countries, like let's say China, India, US, Russia, all of these countries sharing data, and a lot of this data could be replication. So how much of replication would you actually want? The obvious engineering or logical answer would this be, there's nothing called enough, because there's no full coverage of space. You can never have a full certainty of what's going on in space. Data from different sources always helps verify and cross-check your errors. So, but it's a political question of how much repetition do you want? And because of these three questions, these challenges, it's very difficult to tell whether a multilateral agreement can actually be signed because there are political interests here. It's not easy to set up radar sites because they have the ability to track missiles. You have other treaties like the Missile Technology Control Regime or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where they will raise questions about the nuclear utility, the nuclear utility of such radars or sensors. So it's more of a political question. We can definitely try to replicate it if for example, in the comprehensive test, there is a worldwide network of seismic sensors, but seismic sensors are much cheaper and they're not as expensive as radars or electro-optical sensors, right? So the question is about who can pay for it. It's ultimately boils down to who can pay for it and who's politically ready to share sensitive data or allow other citizens to enter the country and examine the radar sites. So that's not a simple answer, but that's a way they can think about an answer.
So I understand that, there are multiple challenges of culminating multilateral treaty when it comes to multilateral treaty or a data sharing agreement on SSA. But let's assume for a minute that, it is feasible and state parties have agreed to go ahead with the agreement for sharing SSA amongst themselves. Now that I know that Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is the foremost international agreement when it comes to governing outer space, it lacks a verification mechanism, right? So nations have agreed to be bound by OST, but we really don't have a mechanism where we can track, monitor, and evaluate their compliance with its provision. So, do you think there is a linkage here that, can a SSA data sharing agreement actually facilitate verification under OST? Or maybe verification under some of the other international treaties related to outer space? Do you think that is a factor that we must consider?
That's a very interesting thought experiment to do. In fact, we're doing this thought experiment in a project thinking about arms control verification in outer space and what are the different ways we can do it. So to do that thought experiment, let's just assume that there is a multilateral agreement, right? Let's not say that there's a multilateral SSA agreement. Let's say it's a multilateral data sharing agreement where there is they're paying only for the software platform which is doing all the data processing. Every country is sharing data. So in one sense, every country sharing their data itself is a level of transparency that it's unmatched. We have not seen that level of transparency because China and Russia are quite secretive about what their activities are in space. So if they start sharing data, for example, then it's going to be a new level of transparency, and that itself will induce compliance, right? Because if you're ready to be open about what you're doing and you're not scared to tell others what you're doing, in a way you will tend to comply with international laws or agreed upon behaviors. So data sharing itself will induce a kind of normative behavior that may not come about if countries are very opaque about their activities in space. So multilateral agreements in that has a self-imposing verification mechanism where you're verifying your own actions so that you don't want to be shamed by others, or you don't want to be seen as being non-compliant with international regulations. That's one. Second, if you actually think about what to verify, one thing we have to understand is even if it's all the data, you can't actually tell what kind of a satellite it is, because a satellite can look a certain way through radars and through telescopes. But what capabilities it actually has is something that you can only do by going close to a satellite and taking pictures of it, right? So you can't verify satellite capabilities, but you can try to verify whether a country is behaving in ways that are threatening. For example, let's say a not so friendly country's satellite is making a very, very close approach to your own satellite. Let's say they're within 5 kilometers of your satellite, and they're either they're either trying to jam your signals, or they're interfering with your signals, or just taking pictures. This would be very threatening, or this would be seen as malicious. So one thing you can do is you can have an agreement, let's say for a keep out zone. Let's say the 50-kilometer radius of a satellite is a keep out zone, right? So if satellites are making, if the not so friendly country satellites are making approaches closer than 50 kilometers, this might be verified by SSA data. You can monitor that the satellite is making a close approach, and you can probably raise this concern in a multilateral setting and say, we have a keep out zone agreement, but your satellite is making a close approach to mine. So let's sort this out. That's one way of verifying actions. And I think this is where SSA data is of most use. You can verify certain kinds of behaviors that you yourself said. Let's say the behavior is close approaches. By banning close approaches less than 50 kilometers, you can verify that action. And this is where I see the greatest strength. But it's going to take many, many more years of effort to even come to such an agreement, because countries don't speak the same technical language when it comes to space systems.
Thank you, Pranav, for that detailed discussion on SSA. We do hope that there is more international cooperation in this field, more nations come together, and for the benefit of humanity, share more space data so that we can all protect ourselves from space threat, as well as create a more secure future for all of us. We will wait for a Takshashila discussion document from your end, possibly in the near future. And until then, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the listeners of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.